There's a generation sitting in the middle of every conversation about generations, and nobody ever calls their name. You are not quite a boomer. You were born too late for that. The culture that shaped boomers was already fading by the time you were old enough to notice it. But you are not quite Gen X either. Not the full version. You caught the edge of it. The MTV years, the latchkey afternoons, the sense that the world was a place you had to navigate largely on your own. But even Gen X has a specific flavor you do not fully recognize in yourself. And so you have spent most of your life accepting whatever label was closest and moving on. Baby boomer when someone older needed you to be. Gen X when someone younger needed you to be. Neither one accurate. Neither one worth the argument. What this video is going to tell you is not another label. It is something more specific. The actual psychology of forming in the decade between 1970 and 1980. The specific experiences that shaped you and the precise reason why no generation label is ever quite fit. You know exactly what kind of childhood this was. It was a kind where the adults were mostly somewhere else. MP not absent in a dramatic sense, just occupied. The economy had shifted. Both parents working was no longer a luxury. It was a requirement. And the result was that you came home to an empty house and you figured it out. You made your own snacks. You watched whatever was on television. You sorted out your own boredom. Nobody checked. This was called independence. What it actually was is a generation learning to need very little from other people because other people were not reliably there. You remember the specifics. The sound of a key in the lock when an adult finally came home. The specific freedom of hours that were entirely yours with no schedule and no supervision. The way Saturday morning cartoons were the only ritual that held the week together. Not because an adult organized it, but because the television was always on and you were always in front of it. And underneath all of that, underneath the freedom and the self-sufficiency and the genuine competence it produced, there was something quieter, a low background awareness that you were responsible for yourself in a way that other people's children, in other decades, had not been required to be. You did not call it lonely. Lonely felt like the wrong word for something that was simply normal. And then the world told you what generation you were. And the label felt like it was describing someone who had the same years but a slightly different life. Here is what nobody names directly. The generation born between 1970 and 1980 formed at the exact intersection of two completely different social eras and was assigned to neither of them. The boomer generation formed during postwar prosperity, full employment, rising wages, the specific confidence that comes from a world that is expanding rather than contracting. That confidence is in the boomer psychology in a way that is visible and documented. Gen X formed slightly later, in the Reagan and Thatcher era, in the shadow of AIDS, in the cultural moment of punk and cynicism, and the specific distrust of institutions that defined the 1980s. Gen X psychology carries that cultural formation, the skepticism, the irony, the refusal to be earnest. The people born between 1970 and 1980 were too young for the post-war confidence and too early for the full Gen X cultural formation. They were children during the 1970s, a decade of economic anxiety, energy crises, Watergate, the specific sense that the adults in charge had made a significant mess of things. And they were adolescents during the 1980s, old enough to absorb the MTV era, but young enough that Reagan-era politics was their parents' world rather than their own. The hidden enemy is not a generation. It is the labeling system's inability to account for a decade that does not fit cleanly into either story. The label was built for majority, and this cohort formed at the edge of two majorities simultaneously. Nobody misclassified you on purpose. The system simply was not built to see you clearly. And here is what that invisibility has been doing to your sense of identity every time a generational conversation starts. The generational quiz. Someone sends it around. Social media, a workplace conversation, a family gathering. You take it. The results come back somewhere in the middle. You score high on Gen X cynicism, but your cultural references are split across 2 decades. The quiz cannot quite place you. You can. You have been doing this your whole life. The pop culture conversation. Someone your age mentions a film from 1975, and you have a clear memory of watching it on VHS at age 7. Someone else your age mentions an early 1990s reference, And you have that too. You carry two completely different decades of cultural memory in a way that people 5 years older or 5 years younger simply do not. The cultural span you cover makes you difficult to place in any single conversation. The work dynamic. You are comfortable with authority in a way Gen X often is not. You learned early to manage upward, to figure out what was needed without being told. But you have the Gen X skepticism about institutions. You do not fully trust the organization, and you do not expect it to look after you. You are self-sufficient in the specific way that latchkey children become self-sufficient. Not because you chose it, but because it was the only option available. The parenting difference. If you have children, you notice a specific thing you are doing differently from how you were raised. You check in more. You are present in a way your own parents were not. Not because your parents were bad parents, but because the era did not require parental presence the way the current era does. And sometimes you wonder whether the independence you were given was actually good for you, or whether it was simply what the economy required of your parents at that time. Every one of these moments is the same experience at its core. You are carrying 2 decades simultaneously, and the labeling system only has room for one. Here is what accumulates when you spend decades in a category that does not fit. The self-sufficiency that was trained into you in those latchkey afternoons becomes a reflex that is very hard to unlearn. You handle things alone because that is what you learned to do, not because you are incapable of asking for help, because the habit of not asking was formed before you knew you were forming it. And the psychological cost of that reflex is specific. It shows up in relationships, in the difficulty of allowing people help, in the specific exhaustion of always being the capable one. It shows up in work, in taking on more than is fair because the alternative is admitting a need. It shows up in the quiet background belief that depending on other people is a vulnerability rather than a normal human requirement. Over years, the latchkey reflex calcifies into an identity. You become the person who does not need much. And that identity, while genuinely useful in many situations, carries a cost that does not always get named. But here is where the whole story changes. Because the formation experience of the 1970 to 1980 decade is not simply a story of absence. It is also a story of something specific being built. The assumption about latchkey formation is that the primary outcome is emotional deficit. The child left to manage alone learns that care is unreliable, that self-sufficiency is necessary, that the world is a place where you cannot always count on others. That framing treats the experience primarily as a loss. The data suggests a more complicated picture. Research on self-directed development. Children who are required to manage their own time, solve their own problems, and entertain themselves without adult mediation consistently show specific cognitive gains alongside the emotional costs. Pattern recognition, problem-solving independence, the specific ability to occupy time productively without external direction. Creative self-sufficiency. The generation born 1970 to 1980 did not just absorb the costs of latchkey formation, it also built something real in those empty afternoons. The hours of unsupervised time produce a specific kind of brain, one that knows how to be alone without distress, that can generate its own direction, that does not need external structure to function. This is not a consolation prize. This is a documented cognitive profile that took decades of independent development to produce. The twist is not that the latchkey experience was actually fine. Some of it was not fine. The twist is that what was built inside it, quietly, without acknowledgement, in empty houses across an entire decade, was a specific and durable architecture of self-direction that the supervised generations did not develop in the same way. Your brain's development in those years was doing something specific. Unstructured time, time without adult direction, without scheduled activities, without external goals imposed from outside, activates a different part of the brain than directed learning does. When a child is to find their own occupation, their own challenge, their own reason to engage with the world, the brain's self-regulation systems develop under genuine pressure, not artificial pressure, real daily pressure. The generation born 1970 to 1980 had this in extraordinary volume. The culture had not yet produced the scheduled childhood, the constant activities, the adult supervised play dates, the structured afternoons that defined childhood in later decades. The time was genuinely free. And the brain, given genuinely free time, built its own navigation system. This is what psychologists call internal locus of control. The belief, built through repeated experience rather than instruction, that your own actions determine your outcomes, that you are the agent of your own life rather than the recipient of what the environment provides. It is one of the strongest predictors of resilience, adaptability, and long-term well-being identified in the research. The generation born 1970 to 1980 built this by default, not because anyone designed it that way, because the era simply required it. The specific combination, internal locus of control built through self-direction, cultural literacy spanning two completely different decades, the adaptability that comes from forming at the seam of two eras. This is not a psychological disadvantage. It is a profile that took very specific conditions to produce. The title of this video asks about the psychology of people born between 1970 and 1980. Here is a complete answer. You formed in a decade that does not have its own cultural story yet. The boomers have theirs. Gen X has theirs. The millennials have theirs. The generation born 1970 to 1980 has been in the footnotes of other people's stories for 50 years. But the psychology is specific and real. You were shaped by the end of postwar optimism, the economic anxiety of the 1970s, and the cultural shift of the early 1980s, all before you were old enough to name what was shaping you. You were required to develop self-direction, self-sufficiency, and a specific tolerance for uncertainty that later generations developed in very different ways. The latchkey experience was not simply deprivation. It was formation. The same formation that produced the self-reliance and internal direction also produced emotional self-containment and the difficulty with depending on others. Both came from the same source. And the cultural bilingualism, the ability to move fluently between the world before the digital revolution and the world inside it, that is yours specifically. MP, not the boomers who adapted from the outside, not the millennials who formed entirely inside it. You were adolescent and young adult when the digital world arrived, old enough to have an analog foundation, young enough to absorb the new world fully. That is not a gap in your story. That is the specific shape of your formation, and it has never been told clearly for one reason. The generation born 1970 to 1980 learned very early not to wait for someone else to tell its story. The label was never going to fit. Not because something was wrong with you, because the label was built for people whose formation had a single, clear cultural story, and yours was built across two. You learned to read rooms before anyone taught you to read. MP, you learned to solve problems before anyone confirmed you were capable of solving them. You learned to find your own way through hours that were entirely yours in a world that was too busy to watch. That is not a childhood without supervision. That is a childhood that trusted you before you trusted yourself. You did not grow up too fast. You grew up exactly as fast as the era required. And the generation that raised itself does not wait to be discovered. It already knows the way. What is the one memory that captures what your childhood actually felt like? The specific moment that nobody who grew up in a different decade would quite understand. One sentence. I want to see how many of us were in the same empty house. Subscribe for a new video every week. And the next one goes even deeper into the specific economic experiences of this generation. You will recognize it immediately.